Dave Jackson, welcome. Man, I don't think we've ever actually recorded before, have we?
No, we've talked a bunch at different events and things like that, but I think this is the first time we've actually pressed record on something. So glad to be here.
Yeah, really glad to have you here. That's strange to me because I think I met you in 2017 and we both podcast a lot. And anyway, I'm glad to finally cross paths with you. Really happy to have you here today.
Yeah, glad to be here. This should be fun.
So we're going to be talking about the state of podcasting, past, present, future. I'd love to hear your start in podcasting because you're one of the OGs in this space. So I'll let you kind of run with that.
Yeah, I always tell people, I'm not making this up. It was in my brother's basement. I just got divorced. I had a water cooler right to the right of me. I had a flush pipe right behind me. So the whole time I'm recording, I'm like, please don't flush the toilet. And then I had a dryer on the other side of the wall. I mean, it was a basement. So you get that idea. And I just remember the first time a friend of mine came back from a marketing thing and he said, and this totally dates me, he goes, do you know how you missed the MySpace boat? And I'm like, yeah, don't rub it in. He's like, the next big thing is going to be podcasting. And I remember I Googled it and there was 1.5 pages. And I was like, wait, how do you spell that? 1.5 pages. There was just nothing on it. And so when I finally kind of pieces parted one together and I uploaded a file and then I saw it come back down in an app I was using, I was like, oh, I get this now. And so I just grabbed my flag and I was like, I hereby claim podcasting is my next big thing. So it's been a lot of fun. The fun part was, though, I'm all excited about it. And you'd ask people like, hey, do you listen to podcasts? And it was all like, do I need an iPod? It just, nobody knew about it. So it's been fun to just watch it grow. And I remember when they parodied Siri on Saturday Night Live, I was like, we've hit mainstream if they're making fun of it now. So that was really cool.
Yeah, I've noticed that not just the parodies, but also there's actual shows based around podcasting. And I'm not like a big TV guy, but sometimes I'll be working in the office and my wife listens to some of them. Like, they just said podcasting. I still like, it's still a little early, Dave. So like with that type of thing, so I still fanboy. I'm like, oh my gosh, they said podcasting on TV, right? Like the fact that it's being acknowledged though. And at this point, like back then, 1.5 pages on Google blows my mind to think that's what it looked like with podcasting. And now I'd say almost everybody knows about it, right? Like it's changed a lot since then.
Yeah, it's I know Edison Research does, they basically research every year. And I think we're up near like 70 to 73% of people have at least heard the phrase. So we haven't quite gotten to all those people under a rock yet, but we're still working on it. But yeah, and it is weird to hear like the news just like, hey, thanks so much for watching. And for more information, subscribe to our podcast. And I was like almost every news channel does that now. So it's just kind of one of those things. And it's funny because I've been at family events and I remember my one cousin finally said, all right, I'm going to ask it. He goes, I don't care. And I go, what? He goes, what's a podcast? And I'm like, oh, do you have an iPhone? He goes, I do. And so I started to show him and literally all of my other cousins are like, wait. So nobody wanted to be the person that goes, I have no idea what you're talking about. I'm so happy that you like podcasting, but what the heck is it? So that's really what you have to do is, and we were both in PodFest and I was doing a clinic in the airport because somebody saw I had a podcast shirt on and I was talking to this other person and they said, well, what do I do? I'm like, oh, just pull up your phone, type this in, hit search, that whole 9 yards. So we've come definitely a long way, but there's still those people and that's fine. There's no shame in, like you said, you're not much of a TV guy. I'm not much of a TV guy. So you miss stuff every now and then and you jump in when you find out about it and enjoy it.
It's funny that your family was, you are schoolofpodcasting.com, Dave Jackson, one of the greatest educators in all of podcasting, right? And your family finally got the courage to be like, so what is it that you do? Because I don't think it's radio, right? Like, and I get it. Grandma and grandpa are always probably going to assume that we are radio show hosts is kind of just where I've let it just be like, you know what? That's good enough, Grandma. I think I'll let you have that. That's what I do, right?
That's it. I always tell people, I'm like, it's kind of like a radio show, except for the internet. So instead of just being as strong as my signal, I go worldwide. And they're like, oh, wow, that's cool. And then you can kind of see in their eyes, they're like, I still don't get it. But that's all right. They nod their head and smile. So that's good.
We'll come back to that in a second here about like kind of where podcasting is at and kind of where it fits into multimedia. Media is a global thing, right? But before we do that, I wanted to ask, like I listened to a bunch of podcasts today before we recorded to kind of hear just what you've been talking about and stuff like that. And I have a question. I don't know if you'll actually know it because I didn't hear you like anyone ask you this on your on any interview with you. But do you remember who your first guest was, or the first time that you decided to give that idea a shot?
Oh, boy, that's a great question. I could go back and look because for the longest time I was just a solo person. If I had to guess, you know what? It was a musician. It was probably because my first show was for musicians, and I kept contacting people that were big in the 80s, but this is now 2005. So they were kind of on their way down. And I think it was a guy named Joe Lynn Turner, who back in the 80s was in a band called Rainbow. And I just remember I asked him, hey, I do this show for musicians. We're explaining what the industry is about. And he was still, had his solo career now and this and whole nine yards. And we're just sharing advice for young musicians. And he's like, oh, count me in. And so yeah, I think I recorded it over Skype. It probably sounds absolutely horrible today if I listen to it. But the first couple, and that was the thing that was really blowing me away is, I looked up at these guys. One guy is Carmine Appice, or Appice. I can never figure out how to say his last name, but he was the drummer in Rod Stewart and Ozzy Osbourne and a whole bunch of other things. And then I'm a guitar player. There was a guy named Joe Bonamassa, which at the time was just starting out. And now he's a huge, like, if you go to a Joe Bonamassa concert now, you're paying $90 a ticket. But it was interesting because I had no business talking to these people. But because I had a podcast, they're like, oh, sure, I'll come on your radio show. And the one guy that was the drummer, this is a key. If somebody will not come on your show, realize that when they say no, it might mean not now, and wait till they have something to promote. So he had just launched a website with a bunch of lessons on. So he realized that part of my audience was going to be drummers. So he was like, oh, I'll come on. So I'm pretty sure those are probably one of those was probably the first. So
that's really cool. What year was that? So you started in 2005. What year did you start having guests on?
Probably sometime in that year, because I started in April 2005, and by the end of the year, I probably started bringing people on. So it was always fun, and that's like I said back then, that you had Skype, which you use what you had basically, and it worked, and you go from there.
It's really funny because now I feel like the red carpet has been rolled out for podcast guests. So anyone who's watching or listening to this and you're like now into podcast guesting, it's like, just click this link and everything will be perfect. And back then it was probably some effort, right? Like they had to know what they were doing.
Yeah, you had to have somebody that and luckily because they were musicians, most of them had microphones. I remember one guy I called on the phone because you could get a phone number that tied into Skype, but unfortunately, if you have to dial somebody or if they have to dial you, it's going to sound like the phone. And there's no way to make the phone not sound like the phone because it was invented back whenever, horse and buggy. And they purposely cut off the upper end so it's not as clear and it's not as bassy, which is why the phone always sounds like this. And it just doesn't work. But, the great thing about guesting is you grow your network. And so I do a combination of both. I do guests to grow my network, and I do solo shows to grow my influence. And some people do one or the other. And I'm like, no, do both. But I know Jordan Harbinger is a really popular guy. And he was on a show that he built up this big audience. And then basically through a series of events, he ended up starting another show. And he just reached out to his network that he built up through all these guests that he had on his show. So that network definitely comes in handy.
It really does. As a matter of fact, for people listening that are strictly guests, remember the hosts that they've had you on the show. Like, keep a Rolodex of them, for lack of a better term. And then when the day comes that you might decide to start a show, you already have all those relationships. And even if they're not your ideal guests, they probably know them. Because think about it, podcast hosts, they've interviewed a lot of people, a lot of them that have kept it going. So I think it's a really powerful thing on either side of the mic. Really keep those relationships going, build out a Rolodex. That's been a huge hack for me from day one. I've kept in contact with everyone who's ever been a guest on my show or people whose shows I've been on. And because of that, people are like, man, Alex, you have such a big network. I'm like, it happened one episode at a time, whether it was the guest or the host. And yeah, now I do, but it's just been over time.
Yeah, and what happens, I had somebody yesterday contact me, and they said, hey, I'm having a weird problem with my computer. Do you know of anybody that could somehow remote into my computer and fix it? And because I've had him on my show, I'm like, oh, Scott Johnson is a Computer Tutor Florida guy. I'm like, here, he can dial it in. And so those are the things that, like, I didn't really benefit from that, but I benefited because I now have two people like that. Dave guy's pretty cool. And you mentioned your Rolodex, my favorite one, and this is the actual name of the program, Less Annoying CRM. is my favorite CRM because it's not about funnels. It's just about, hey, can you remind me in 6 weeks to contact Alex or whatever? It's so if that's the kind of thing you're looking for, I love that website, and it works on your phone, et cetera, et cetera. So
I know a lot of podcasters who use that one, so it's a good suggestion there. Dave, moving this right along here, I said I'd kind of come back to the whole radio argument with Grandma, right? I don't want to get back into that side of the argument. What I want to talk about, though, is where you see podcasting at today. And I think in many ways it's disrupted parts of TV, but definitely a lot of radio. I don't want to get into disruption necessarily, but like, where do you see where we're at today? Like what is the state of podcasting in your mind today of like where it's at?
yeah, it's still growing, and it's interesting because about a month ago they came out with some stories that some of the number of podcasts were going down, and there's a reason for that. There's a certain free media host that made it super easy to start a podcast, and it would submit it to Apple for you and all these other different places. Well, then Apple decided that, hey, we end up with a lot of podcasts with like one episode of people going test, is it working? And so they quit doing that. So all of a sudden, Apple used to get this big pile of new podcasters every month or every week or whatever. And now they're not. And everybody's like, oh, does this mean people are stopping podcasts? No, it means all the, for lack of a better phrase, junk podcasts are no longer an Apple podcast. So the number went down. But in reality, if you look at the number of active shows, and a lot of people define that as, a podcast that's had an episode in, say, 60 or 90 days, something like that. Then it's still going up. And the beautiful thing is even if it was, let's say it was going down, which it's not, but let's say it flattens off, the number of listeners is going up. So if it doesn't grow as fast, but the number of listeners does, that just means more listeners for you. So it's definitely going up and up. And I forget, there's a soap opera that is now put out, I think it's The Young and the Restless, and they put it out as a podcast. They just take the audio of the show, including the dramatic music, and what do you mean? That's, how dare you? But it's now a podcast. And I was like, well, you know what? Why not? It's, $20 to reach the world. Why not? I'll give it a shot.
It's interesting. I know a few people who have not necessarily listened to that one, but similar type shows that are made for TV, and I guess for lack of a better term, the staff of that, right, has put it into podcast format without changing anything, just uploading strictly audio file. And people say it's relaxing because how it is. People, they talk about, oh, I just like the TV on the background for the noise. And so that's like when they listen to that type of podcast, where it's not the average person who listens to podcasts, because most people listen because they want to learn something new. But sometimes people now are just listening completely in the background. But hey, at the very least, it's opening up to podcasts. So I'm thankful for that.
That's it. Yeah. Or you're like me. I have tinnitus, so my ears ring all the time. I always have to have something on in the background, because if I don't, all I hear is ee, and that drives me nuts. So that's why I listen all the time.
You're right. Yeah. Speaking of this point, like I want to kind of flip it to the podcast guest side of things. Something I've been noticing happening. So the shows, like you're saying, it is growing still a little bit, because we're looking at active shows now, which a show that only had test, is anyone going to listen to this? That's not a podcast. Like that you just figured something out and didn't stick with it. But on the flip side, I think because of the listenership growth, that there are just floods of people coming into podcast guesting. Like it's way more competitive than it's ever been in my mind. And I see that number continue to rise. Even with our product, Podmatch, we are seeing right now the fastest rate of signups from specifically the guest side of the platform. What do you think is going on? Like, do you have any perspective on this? I'd love to get your wisdom.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things. Everybody that jumps into podcasting is like, hey, this is going to be great. It's going to be fun. And then they do it. And by episode 3, they're like, wow, I had no idea this was going to take this long, because they thought a 15-minute podcast was going to take 15 minutes. And by the time you figure out what you're going to talk about, then you record it, then you edit it, and then you type up a paragraph about it. Congratulations. On your best day, that 15-minute podcast took you an hour at least. And so people understand the power of podcasting, but they can't squeeze it into their schedule. So what they're doing now is they're using tools like Podmatch, which takes out the guesswork. You're getting a much better match of people. I'm no longer getting real estate people trying to be on my show about podcasting. So you find the power of podcasting, you find a good match, you get in front of the people you need to get in front of, and it's not as much time. It doesn't, you don't have to worry about equipment. Well, you need to have a microphone, obviously, but it's just one of those things where I can get in front of the people I want to get in front of. The host gets great content for their show. it's just a win-win. And so I think so many people now are like, okay, I want to get into podcasting. I see the power of it. I don't have enough time or resources, or for whatever reason, I'm not going to do my own. But I know a few people, especially authors, used to try to set up a book tour. Well, now you just set up a podcast tour and you get in front of the audience that you need to get in front of.
It's really interesting. I've been seeing it again get a little bit more competitive. So for everybody know, like my pitch success rate previously for getting on podcast was 97%. And quick disclaimer for everyone's like, that's impossible. How'd you get that high? I only pitch podcasts that would have me on. Let's put it that way. So like if they weren't going to say yes, I didn't do it. And for the most part, that happened. But that same pitch is now under 60% success rate. And that's because at that point, when I was doing that, or like years past, I was probably, and I say this as humbly as I can, I was probably the best at what I was pitching to talk about. And now, when I was probably also the only person pitching to be in that, there are 10 people that can pitch the same thing, 5 of which are probably more qualified than I am. So even a good pitch isn't working as well anymore. It's really about, like, in my mind, Dave, I want to get your perspective on this, is looking at the podcasts that are early stages, because everyone kind of goes for the shows that have, like you, thousands of episodes, right? Or they go for the one that's got 50, 100. But in my mind, you almost need to learn as a guest which podcasts early on are showing potential that they could keep on going and pitch those so it's not as competitive. And I don't know if that's flawed logic, but again, I'm just looking for your wisdom, Dave. What are your thoughts on that?
I had a spell where I was only doing interviews if you had, say, 5 to 10 episodes. So still early, but you had to at least publish. And that's my only criteria now. If you have 1 episode, I will be on your show. And the reason for that is, number one, a year from now, that's the one that'll probably still have the most downloads, maybe, because it's been out longer. And the second one is, to me, the biggest benefit. It's always great to get in front of an audience, but like we were talking earlier, it's the relationships. And so that person's going to remember that, wow, that person, she came on my show when I was on episode 3. And, I always hear Todd Cochran talk about from Blueberry that he interviewed GoPro before they were even a name at some tech show. And he still knows the people over there because they remember that Todd was one of the guys that really gave them a boost when they were just this little startup company. So for me, I always, I rarely say no unless I just go, can you please help me explain who I'm talking to? And that's the other thing I'm learning with Podmatch is the fact that you don't have to say yes to everyone. I had one last night come up and the person said, I'm looking for CEOs of companies with 100 to 500 people. Well, that's not me. And I was like, wow, I think I could have been a fit for this person, but I'm not who he's looking for. And I just said pass. And I think sometimes we white knuckle that, like, well, if I give up on this one person, maybe nobody else is going to come up. And I'm like, no, that's not the case. There are a lot of people in the world that you can interview.
It's a good point. I think the advice I give to a host who's watching or listening to this is to make sure you stay in your niche. And I want to get into that in a second here as we kind of transition to talking about the future of podcasting. In my mind, Dave, from what I've seen, getting your podcast more niche is becoming more and more and more and more important. And so again, a host making sure that they're protecting their listeners by bringing on guests that fit that niche, I think is just going to become more important as time goes on. What are your thoughts on the power of the niche? And is that something you're seeing grow more and more in the future as well?
Yeah, it is. And one other thing before I hit the niche is also that always depends on your schedule. Like I do a lot of interviews because I leave time in my schedule for that. So that's always, your mileage may vary. If you've got a super tight schedule, you can't do that many interviews. But in terms of the niche, it really is the difference. I always use the example of let's say you want to do a show about being more confident. Okay, who doesn't want to be more confident? And you're like, wait, what about being a more confident parent? Well, sure, because we're all like, hey, this thing didn't come with an operations manual. What do I do here? But then when you go, wait, what about being a more first-time parent? Ooh, now we just cut out some people, but now we have the people that are, again, going back to white knuckles. How do I get this thing to stop crying? Wow. But what if we did, now you don't have to niche down. I'm just making an example. What if I said, how to be a more confident first-time interracial parent? Oh, now we just wiped out a ton of people out of the pool, but the people that are left are like, oh, and we need to talk about some things here about raising, a child of interracial parents. So the deeper you go, it's like having a river that's only, 8 inches wide, but it's 5 miles deep versus a river that's a mile wide and 8 inches deep. So it really depends on what you want to do, but you do end up with people that go, I did you read my diary? This was made for me. And so when you get that emotional connection, number one, anytime you can have somebody go, wow, I don't feel alone anymore, that is so powerful. And so it definitely comes in handy. Now you can niche yourself right out of an audience, right? If I
Right. Yeah.
all right, interracial parents that are left-handed. Okay, no, we've gone too far.
I mean, if you're looking for someone to win a prize and you only need one, then yeah, niche down until you figure it out. But yes, what you're saying, I think, is just so important. I don't even need to reinforce that because I think you just said it so clear. But the thing is, when you find your tribe, dive deep with them. Like you're saying, go deep with them and saying, hey, everybody's going to love this, right? I think those days are really behind us when it comes to succeeding in podcasting on either side of the mic. If you're the guest, look for something that actually fits your niche really well. And Dave, I actually want to talk a little bit toward the end of our time together here is about some more future stuff. I'm hearing a lot of talk about AI these days and a lot of talk about podcasting 2.0 and like where's the freedom of podcasting going after these big companies kind of coming after it. Again, you're a guy who keeps up with all things podcasting through School of Podcasting and just your extensive knowledge in the industry. I really want to learn from you. Where is this thing heading and how are those two things really playing into it?
Yeah, it's the podcasting 2.0. I love the idea. I still think it's maybe a couple years ahead of its time, but I really want to see it come into play because what they've done is, if you think about a car in the 50s, you had a steering wheel, 4 tires, brake, and steer. Then somebody invented the radio and stuck it in there, and then somebody invented power steering. Well, that's where they're at. They're adding more features to podcasting. We're just going to need car manufacturers to put them in the car. And so slowly, the media hosts are adding some, which will mean eventually the apps will start making features for that. But I love the fact that, number one, somebody might give you $5 because they think your show is good. And somebody else will go, wait a minute, I got a 50 back here in the couch cushions. Here, you can have this. So you're letting your audience decide what your show is worth. And there's no way to cancel me because it's me and my audience. There's no advertisers that you can go hack. Now, on the other side, advertising is definitely jumping in. The one thing that makes me worried is there is one company that I can't remember the name right now, but they basically go over, transcribe your show, look through it, and then give you a rating. And I was like, I grew up in the 80s, and in the late 70s, early 80s, there was a group called Up With People, and they were fun. They were uplifting and positive, but they were very white. Like, there was nothing controversial about Up With People. And I remember once as like a 9-year-old, they were the Super Bowl halftime show, and they're like, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Up With People. And I just remember as a 9-year-old going, not these guys again, because they didn't offend you, but on the other hand, it was just, yay, positivity, yay. And you're like, okay, I get it. So I don't want to be whitewashed. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays, but more and more advertisers are coming in. And I think you're just going to end up with big shows that have advertisers, the kind of middle class, for lack of a better phrase, that have a decent sized audience. Those might do a Patreon, a Glow, Supercast, whatever, some sort of crowdfunding. And then you'll have the value for value, the streaming Satoshis and Bitcoin thing. And I think as that comes along, I actually did a test and I said, what if I had gotten X amount of Bitcoin 2 years ago? Because I think at the time I had a whopping like $2 worth of Bitcoin. And if I'd done that 2 years ago, it'd be worth 7 now. So when somebody says, hey, I'm earning a whole, 7 cents an hour here. I'm like, yeah, but in 2 years from now, it'll be a whopping, 14 cents an hour. But if we can get more of our audience to do that and it makes it easier, that's going to be a fun one to watch. But they're all headed in the upward direction. So that's the beauty of it.
Yeah, it really is interesting to keep an eye on how crypto and stuff like that and podcasting 2.0 are kind of like merging that together. And like you said, it's years ahead, and I agree with that. Real quick on the AI side of things, you kind of touched on it with the advertisements, but I'm hearing a lot more hosts generating their descriptions, titles, even the questions they want to ask their guests through AI. Do you have any perspective on that or thoughts on if that's going to be healthy in the future or unhealthy?
Yeah, I've been playing with Capshow and swellai.com. And the reason I kind of like those is you upload your episode there and they're transcribing you. So the summary or whatever they're doing kind of sounds like you because, well, it came from you. Where I think things get weird is when you go into the Chat GPT world and you're just having it type something based on whatever is on the internet or things like that. So I'm kind of interested. I'm a little scared as well. I'll be honest with you. There are times that I'm like, this could be, it's like a superpower. It could be used for good and it could be used for evil. And so I'll be interested to see. I think the thing that makes me not worry about it is one of the best things of podcasting is everybody has their own personality. And we'll see if they can somehow artificially intelligence, create a personality. We'll see how that works. But my buddy Daniel J. Lewis had a great line on this. He goes, look, it's an assistant. It's not an employee. And even Deidre over at Cap Show, she'll tell you, like, we get you about 85% of the way there, but there still has to be a human that comes in and maybe edits it or tweaks it or things like that. So it's exciting. It's kind of like, ooh, this, I feel like I should like write down a journal entry because I think in the future I'm going to look back and go, do you remember Chat GPT? We're all going to go, oh man, do you remember that? But it's a little spooky, but anytime something unnew, that's always a little spooky. So I'm excited by it. Just because I'm a technology nerd, but it should be fun to watch.
Dave Jackson, that's good to know, man. I really appreciate it. And also I appreciate you always throwing down with the guitar at Podfest. Every year I've been to Podfest, this guy ends up on stage with an electric guitar and just rocks out. So if you all have never been to Podfest, you got to come one year. Remember the first year I saw him, like, this guy's a podcasting legend and crushes it with the guitar. Anyway, as we're ending our time together, man, I heard you on a podcast and you said the words, you may be able to outsell me as a podcast coach, but it'd be very hard for you to outserve me. I would just love to hear your perspective on service in this industry as a final thought before we end here.
Yeah, I think every good podcaster has the heart of a servant because like your audience has to benefit before you benefit. That's just the bottom line. And so for me, my background's in training, and I always say it's kind of selfish for me, but I love to serve people because I never will forget Marcy Rosenbaum called me up crying. And I said, Marcy, what's the matter? She's like, I'm in iTunes. It was a while ago. So I was in iTunes. And I go, okay, yeah, I remember we submitted it. I said it'd be like a day or two. And she goes, no, you don't understand. I called you and I said, I can't do this. I hate technology. And I told her, well, we'll work through that. And so she didn't believe it, but there she was in iTunes. And to me, that puts so much gas in my tank when I have somebody that goes, nobody's ever going to listen to me. And I go, no, they will. Trust me. And then, we shape your message a little bit and buff out the rough spots. And then you put out a podcast and you're like, holy cow. And it's always funny because they go from nobody's going to listen to me to, oh no. And I'm like, what? And they're like, people are listening to me. And I'm like, yeah, I told you. And they're like, oh my, and then they get all stage fright, so it's always interesting. But yeah, to me, when if we go back to 2005, I looked at my brother, I said, this is going to change the world. I said, because to me, right, if you're everything is a hammer, how's that go? If you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So if you're a teacher, everything looks like a teaching aid. And I was like, we can learn from other cultures because we're going to bridge the gap across the world. So so for me, I've always seen it as a way to serve an audience, and the people that I interview that are really having success always have that, well, I'm just trying to serve my audience. And consequently, a lot of those people are doing really, really good. So for me, that's like step one.
Dave, I really appreciate your time today, and thank you so much for the education you've brought to me through School of Podcasting, hearing you on stages, and just getting to have conversations with you. I really appreciate the wisdom you share with us today.
Alex, thanks for having me, buddy.